Welcome back. We're now being joined by economists from the Financial Derivatives Company Limited. Here with us in the studio, Raphael Yemito is to my immediate left, and to my far left is Damilola Akinbami. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having us.
The last time you were here, we talked about the inflation figures, and right now you're back. I'm going to start with Raphael. Raphael, the numbers just moved up slightly from 7.9% to 8%, and for many people, they wonder, it's just a very slight movement, but I'm sure to you, there is more to the figures that we're getting. So could you tell us what you think happened? I know that there are other components of the inflation rate that we're going to look at in the course of this discussion.
Yeah, it's actually a slight movement, but it's beginning to show the impact of other variables that are coming up, like the election spending, auto policy by anticipation of the auto policy that will kick in by July 1st, and some other indicators. Basically, it's 8%, and it's within the range of our forecast. So it's really an indication of where inflation will be in the coming months.
Damilola, do you totally agree with him?
Yes, like I think that you're going to ask us how we came up with our own projection and all that.
We'll look at all of that.
Yes.
So I know that you always release forecasts
yes.
as to the direction that inflation may take.
And it just shows that, because usually there's a consensus view that inflation is going to be around a particular period or a particular range, and there's always like a band of plus or minus 1 to 2%. So fine, it was a marginal increase to 8%, but it's still, our 7.9 is still within that band. And like my colleague mentioned also, it's just an indication of some qualitative measures, because our regression captured quantitative measures. So qualitative measures like the security spending that you mentioned, and even also election spending that you also talked about. So it's just an indication that inflationary pressures are beginning to manifest earlier than anticipated. So I totally agree with what he said.
Okay, if you look at the breakdown of the figures that we got, the food inflation is still the highest, and we've seen that rise to 9.7%. I know that we can have it on the TV screen for our viewers to quickly take a look. We've seen food inflation rose from 9.4% to 9.7%. Increase in prices of food has been one of the challenges that we face. But if you tie that with the agriculture program of the government to ensure that we are self-sufficient, are we seeing any results in relation to that? And why are we having rise in prices of food?
Oh well, the government is doing what needs to be done in order to make us more self-sufficient in terms of food production and all. And while we're seeing an increase in food prices, one aside of the security issues that are occurring in the north, we're in the early planting season, so obviously we expect prices to go up. By the time we move towards the harvest, there's going to be an abundance of foodstuff, and where there's an increase in supply of an item, prices come down. So these are some of the factors that actually causing the uptick in food prices.
Okay, you try to. I'm still sticking with Damilola. You talked about qualitative and quantitative factors, and you mentioned insecurity. And I know that a portion of what we produce in Nigeria comes from the north, but we do not know how much comes from the northeast when we now try to look at the whole thing, whole picture. But how far do you think that was going to affect inflation, or how far did it affect inflation for the month of May?
Like you mentioned, we can't definitely or put a figure to the amount that is being produced in the north and all. But with everything that is happening, even farmers have left their lands. Nobody wants to go there to do anything. So obviously it has had a significant impact. Aside from that, even the transportation cost, moving it from the north to the south or from anywhere, even if it's from the south to the east or anywhere, we have major infrastructure issues right now. So that has increased the distribution cost. If you look at the slides that we sent out, it was one of the points we raised, that distribution cost has had an impact also in this marginal uptick in inflation that we saw in May.
Okay, Yemito, in terms of the core inflation rate, we've seen it also jump.
Yes, for the core inflation, we usually have a seasonal movement in the core. maybe for some particular period of the year, we see the core inflation come down due to global trends. But basically here in Nigeria, we see that the core inflation reduces or declines at a particular time of the year, and then it picks up. So evidently, this uptick in the core inflation is telling us that we are in the period where we'll see a rise in the core inflation, and it needs to be monitored to avoid a serious spiral in the headline inflation rate.
Okay, Damilola, I know that a lot of underlying factors that affect inflation rate, and of course that is going to decide in terms of what statement or position the authorities will be taking going forward. I just want us to look at something more in terms of this food inflation rate. If you look at the components of the basket of food that actually led to the rise in inflation, we had bread and cereals, fruits, soft drinks, meat groups. It seems that these are the kinds of food that Nigerians seem to consume more than all other kinds of food. We have bread, cereals. Of course, flour is one part of bread that is actually used to make bread. But why do we always track only this kinds of food when we look at the food inflation?
Well, I won't say we only track those types of food. I'm sure the NBS captures or covers a variety of food components. But like you mentioned, these are what we call staples. These are what the average Nigerian consumes and all that. So if there's any change in the prices of these items, it will have an impact on the food basket because they carry a larger weight. If you look at maybe, for instance, let's just assume that rice, I'm not saying rice is not a major commodity, but let's just assume that rice isn't. Obviously, even if there's an increase in the price of rice, the impact on the food basket might not be as significant because people don't consume it. But if you compare with a commodity that is consumed a lot, you would see the impact. So that's why commodities like bread and cereal, according to the NBS, the increases were what drove the increase in food inflation.
We'll try to talk about government policies earlier on, Yemito. The auto policy of government, which was what you mentioned, and we have elections coming up next year. In fact, we've seen elections in some states at the moment. How do you think that all of these things, I know spending will have to increase in some parts of the country, but in all, how do you think government policies drive inflation?
Well, okay, one way is through money supply. Money supply is inflationary in nature. And for the whole of 2013, we had money supply in negative territory, even up till March 2014. And at the last MPC meeting, we were made to understand that money supply is now about 5.81%, which is positive. And once you have inflation money supply in positive territory, then it's an indication of rising inflationary pressures.
Okay, if we're having a money supply in rising in the country, we've seen the central bank at various times trying to curb that through the monetary instrument that it uses. Isn't that working?
Yeah, it is working. There is a limit to how far you can check something. If you continue to follow a contractionary monetary policy, it will affect some other indicators like economic growth and other variables like that. But the contractionary monetary policy of the CBN, especially the use of administrative tools, has been really useful in helping some other indicators. Despite the fact that money supply is at 5.81, which is positive, we still have an inflation gap, which is still very good for investors and for development of the economy. Now,
Damilola, now that we've talked about the central bank, I know that one of the reasons why the previous administration, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, kept on either holding on to interest rate or raising it, as the case may be, is because of inflation. Now, do you think that when the next MPC meeting holds in July, are we going to toe the other way, the other path? Because based on what the central bank governor, Godwin Emefiele, actually talked about, is that there will be a gradual reduction in interest rate. Now that we've seen a rise in inflation again, Do you think you would want to consider that? Do you think the committee would consider reducing interest rate?
First of all, we're looking at two different administrations. There's the Sanusi administration and the new administration in place. And the governor is new, he's just barely a month old and all. And we're of the opinion that he's going to at least look at what is going on, study all the macroeconomic conditions that are taking place and all before he makes any decision. And he's not the only one that's going to make this decision. There's a committee that is going to make this decision and all that. And they're going to look at all the variables in place. And right now, macroeconomic conditions are not at a threatening level, if I may use that word. Fine, we've seen a marginal uptick in inflation to 8%, but if, for instance, because there's going to be another inflation figure that's going to be released before the July MPC. Now, if that inflation figure rises to as high as 10, 11%, this may tilt the balance. And he has said that he has his agenda. He wants to maintain exchange rate stability. He wants to keep inflation as low as possible and reduce interest rates, possibly maybe after election. I know that's a difficult combination to achieve. So we have the opinion that he's going to at least study what the environment is going to be like. But if there are going to be increased macroeconomic threats, that might tilt the balance and we might see maybe more drastic monetary policy actions taking place.
Now, talking about currency and exchange rate, let me come to you. When the central bank chief was given his maiden briefing a few weeks ago, and it talked about gradual reduction in interest rate, we saw the currency market being affected, some kind of negative impact, if you want to call it that. But right now, do you think that with this inflation figure, though it's slight, like we all tried to establish earlier on, are we going to see some impact at all in terms of exchange rate, stability or volatility? Are we expecting something from that angle?
Now, looking at the inflation numbers, we do not expect any significant impact on the forex market. However, there could be a response on consumer prices. That's if exchange rates depreciate further than what it is now, because there is a direct relationship between the interbank rate and the core index. That is, once there is a depreciation in the interbank market, we have prices of items in the core index prices of items in core index tends to increase. So if that happens, then we are likely to see an impact on inflation. But at present, the 8% inflation rate or the 1.1% increase in inflation isn't expected to have any significant impact on the forex market.
Okay, at this point, I'd like you to just hold your thoughts for us. We'll go on a break. We've been talking to two economists from the financial derivatives company, Raphael Yemito and Damilola Akimbami, and we have been examining the inflation numbers from the month of May that was released by the National Bureau of Statistics, and we are considering what factors led to the rise in these numbers and what direction we're likely to take going forward. We'll be right back.